Now to a growing firestorm in Georgia over accusations of voter suppression. Civil rights groups are suing Georgia's Secretary of State and GOP candidate Governor Brian Kemp over a 2017 voter registration law that has more than 50,000 registrations currently on hold. The Associated Press reports that nearly 70% of the voters in limo are African American. Let's bring in Democratic strategist Don Calloway, co-founder of the National Voter Protection Action Fund, and Republican political consultant Shermichael Singleton. Gentlemen, we're going to get into this right now because it's pretty timely. This report, Shermichael, from the AP, it has a few more striking numbers to share that include through a process that Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp calls voter roll maintenance and his opponents call voter roll purges, Kemp's office has canceled over 1.4 million voter registrations since 2012. Nearly 670,000 registrations were canceled in 2017 alone. As you look at this, can you apply the word discriminatory to these cancellations?
Alex, it reminds me a lot of North Carolina, where an appellate court struck down what Republicans were doing there statewide. And I think in their ruling, they wrote it was almost with surgical precision that it targeted African Americans. It also reminds me of the governor in Alabama in 2015, where they closed 31 driver's license centers that disproportionately impacted African Americans. Time and time again, I think we are seeing, unfortunately, with my party, that because they cannot compete with people of color, they're finding other areas to essentially displace those individuals from being able to participate in honestly, our biggest part of being an American, the ability to vote. And I think that is extremely unfortunate.
Shermichael, you're the Republican here. You just said that it's your party. Are you raising your hand? Are you screaming loud and clear trying to say, stop
Alex,
this?
I mean, you know, look, I think a lot of, well, I won't say a lot. There have been a few, I should say, African-American Republicans in the party that have for a long, long time been screaming and shouting, saying, run on the issues. There are a lot of African-Americans who will say, yes, I am conservative on a lot of things. But with the current Republican Party, they will never vote Republican. And Alex, I got to tell you, I don't blame them. And many times I am beginning to ask myself, you continue to fight for things that you would argue are principles. But when the party continues to do things that you are obviously against, that are obviously disproportionately impacting people merely because they cannot compete, you have to ask, am I even making any type of an impact on this party? And I'm not even sure at this point that I really am.
Now it's got to be frustrating to say the least.
Don't come to me, Alex. Just let Shermichael keep going.
Well, if you have anything more to say, Shermichael, that's great. But Don, you know, and I know you do. I'm going to ask you more about that. But your response to what he's saying and how this might impact the midterms, what do you think about this, Don?
Shermichael's absolutely right. I would just start by pointing out the great Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who points out that elections should be decided by competing within the marketplace of ideas as opposed to trying to reduce and restrict who gets to participate in those discussions. You know, this all goes back to 2013. If you consider the great civil rights movements of our time, a lot of that culminated in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act created a pre-clearance where if you wanted to change voting standards, close polling places, reduce polling hours in states that have a history of pernicious voter suppression, then you had to pre-clear those different changes with the Department of Justice. 2013, Shelby County, Alabama versus Eric Holder invalidated the pre-clearance requirements of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And since then, we have seen 1,200 polling places close in states that were covered by those pre-clearance jurisdictions. So now, but let us not believe that voter suppression is just relegated to the South. We saw what happened in North Dakota this week with the Native American populations being suppressed. Rampant voter suppression in Wisconsin in 2006. Know how much President Trump won that by such a narrow margin. However, this goes back to 2013 Supreme Court decision which invalidated Section 5 and has allowed for a lot of per se suppressive techniques to happen, particularly throughout the American South, and it's terrible. So you have multiple organizations who are fighting this thing on multiple fronts. My group, the National Voter Suppression Action Fund, which is funding organizations who have election protection plans in place. You have the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, who is challenging representing Brian Kemp down in Georgia and will be successful because there's no way that his exact match standard is constitutional. You have Cheryl Eiffel in the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So with many of the great public affairs and civil rights struggles of our time, it has to be a war that's waged on many fronts.
Yeah.
But ultimately, voter suppression is real, and we're going to beat it.
Look, Shermichael, Daily Beast outlines a few things that Don has just said, and the title is Republicans Have a Secret Weapon in the Midterms, Voter Suppression. 2 points he's made about closing polling places, and I'm just going to add the caveat in communities of color, purge voters from the polls. Another one, eliminate early voting. I mean, what is your reaction to all of this, and is this a Republican weapon?
Well, see, I mean, I do find that problematic because a lot of individuals, particularly people of color who are working long hours, multiple jobs, cannot all the time vote on the actual election date. We saw that in Georgia, so people will attempt to vote early based upon the convenience of their schedule. When you begin to eliminate that, again, you impact African Americans. And it's so crazy to me, Alex, about Georgia, because Brian Kemp, I believe several years ago, looked into voter fraud as Secretary of State. And guess what? They didn't really find anything. So I'm thinking logically to myself, what is the legitimate argument that he and Republicans can make for doing that? And I don't see any outside of impacting black voters. And that is a problem and it is unacceptable.
There are no legitimate arguments, Alex, and let's be very clear. The phenomenon that Shermichael just so eloquently described is called a poll tax. Back in the day, you used to have to show up with cash, but now if I restrict the voting hours for working class people who can't afford to make it during restricted hours because they have hourly wage jobs, if I reduce the number of polling places from one side of the county to another, so now it's not in my grandmama's budget to make it across the county, she can't afford a ride or can't get there, we just can't afford that time of day away from jobs, away from childcare. That is the new poll tax. That's exactly what this is.
I want to have our director put back up the race there, the stats where they are right now, and see how extraordinarily close this race is. I mean, could this be the deciding factor between whether Kemp or Abrams wins, Don? I mean, and if so, don't you think there'll be cries of illegitimacy after whomever wins this race?
Well, fortunately, people like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights are on this thing and can file expedited legal motions like temporary restraining orders and permanent injunctions. We found out about it so far ahead of time with 20-plus days before the elections. But the problem is that it absolutely could be a determinative factor because this race is close. Here's the way you beat voter suppression. You get out the word and everybody brings themselves and their friends and everybody they know out to vote. That is the only surefire way to destroy voter suppression. However, you do have those per se obstacles put in place for when people arrive to the ballot box. Souls to the polls, it takes all fronts. Churches,
and see what
schools, everybody's just got to come to the table, but luckily we know about it this far in advance.
Last word, Shermichael, to you.
And really quickly, what I'm concerned about, I think everything Don stated was correct, but I am concerned that African Americans will see what's going on and say, well, you know, maybe my vote does not count. And I want to say, as a black Republican, you guys in Georgia need to go out and vote. It is necessary.
Amen to that. Everyone's got to get out there and vote. Don Calloway, Shermichael Singleton, thank you guys.